If I offered to buy your podcast today, what exactly would I be buying? The episodes? The microphones? The RSS feed? Probably not. In fact, the most valuable thing you've built may be something you don't even recognize as an asset. And if that's true, you might be spending all your time protecting the wrong thing. So today I want to show you what buyers, investors, partners, and successful creator businesses actually value and why your podcast might be worth far more than you realize. This is Legit Podcast Pro. Welcome back. I'm Gordon Firemark, entertainment attorney, educator, and in some circles, I'm known as the podcast lawyer. Now, this show has always been about helping creators navigate the legal and business side of podcasting and content creation, and we're still doing that. But over the next few episodes, I want to broaden the conversation a little bit because many of the most successful people I've worked with over the years started out believing that they were building just a podcast or a YouTube channel or a newsletter or a blog or something. But eventually, they realized that they were actually building something bigger. A full-blown business. Not necessarily by intention, not necessarily overnight, but gradually, one asset at a time. And that's what I want to talk about today, because I think a lot of creators underestimate the value of what they're building. So let's run that little thought experiment. Imagine we sit down for coffee and I say to you, I would like to buy your podcast. I don't want to sponsor it. I'm not going to advertise on it. I want to buy it. Just plain old buy it. So what am I actually buying? Think about this for a second. Now, most creators immediately think about the content, the episode library, the audio files, those interviews, that whole archive of shows. And sure, those things do have some value. But let's take a look at another kind of business. Now, imagine I buy a restaurant. Am I buying yesterday's meals? Well, of course not. Yesterday's meals are either gone or spoiled. They're history. What I'm really buying is the brand. The customer relationships, the reputation, the systems, the recipes, the team, the ability to keep producing results again tomorrow and the next day and the next day. Well, the same thing happens in professional practices. If somebody comes along and buys a law firm, they're not paying for the legal briefs that we wrote 5 years ago. They're paying for our reputation, our relationships with clients, opposing counsel, all that, systems, goodwill, and future opportunity. Now, let's bring this all back to the podcast. If I were to buy your show tomorrow, I wouldn't be all that excited about owning a few hundred MP3 files. I mean, sure, there may be a little value there, but what I'd really want is access to those things that those MP3 files created and they represent. And that's where things get really interesting because that's where the real value often lives. Now, lots of creators spend years focusing on the content, but completely overlooking the assets that content is actually creating. And those assets may be the most valuable part of the entire enterprise. So let's talk about the assets hidden inside your podcast. First thing I'd be buying is trust. And trust is incredibly difficult to build. You earn it one episode at a time, over time, one newsletter at a time, a video at a time. Every time you show up and deliver something useful or entertaining or educational or inspiring, you are making a deposit in what I think of as a trust account. Not a legal trust account, not an attorney-client funds trust account. No, it's an account of trust, right? Okay, most creators never put any dollar value on that trust, but real businesses do. Advertisers, sponsors, partners, clients, buyers, they all do put a value on that trust because trust is what changes behavior. It causes people to listen. It causes people to subscribe. It makes them buy. Trust is what gets people to recommend you to others. And it is often much harder to create than just creating content. The content is just the vehicle. Trust is what gets delivered. And the second thing I'd be buying is your audience. Not your download numbers. No, there's a difference with that. It's not your audience. No, downloads are statistics. Audience is relationship. If you've spent years attracting the attention of a particular group of people and earning the right to show up in their earbuds every week, that's valuable. That's trust. Not because they're numbers, but because they are people who know you. They like you, they trust you, they pay attention to you when you speak. And that is very hard to build. Very hard. And the third thing I would be buying is your brand. Every episode shapes what people think about you. It's your reputation, your expertise, your reliability, your point of view. Whether you realize it or not, every piece of content contributes to that brand equity. So that's another asset many creators don't fully appreciate until much later. And this is still only the beginning, because some of the most successful creator businesses eventually discover that the content itself isn't where most of the value lives. So here's an example. You might have heard of a show called Morning Brew, right? It's a newsletter channel, actually. Morning Brew was launched a number of years ago, but a few years ago, they were acquired in a deal that reportedly was worth around $75 million. Now, if you're not familiar with Morning Brew, it started out as a simple email newsletter focused on business news. 2 college students launched it while they were still in college, and over time, it grew into one of the most successful newsletter brands in the world, reaching millions of subscribers and expanding into multiple media products and lots of different sort of content channels, right? Well, now, think about this for a moment. Nobody paid $75 million because they wanted a collection of old email newsletters. That's not what they were buying at all. They were buying an audience, a trusted brand, a distribution channel, a relationship with millions of readers. The newsletters were important, sure, but the newsletters were really the vehicle that created those assets that they bought. That's where the value was. Access to that audience and the trust that the audience places in the brand. And the same thing is true for creator businesses of every size. You don't need millions of subscribers. You don't need a giant media company. You might get there someday, but anyway, no, the principle is really exactly the same. In fact, I've experienced this myself. I've been podcasting for a long time. In fact, I recently calculated that my first appearance on a podcast was 21 years ago, roughly. Right at the beginning of when podcasting was starting. And my show, Entertainment Law Update, which was launched back in April of 2009. And that Legit Podcast Pro has now been a part of my business for a number of years. And I've appeared on countless podcasts as a guest. And if you asked me whether podcasting has been valuable for my business, the answer is an unqualified, absolutely yes, hell yes, heck yes, it's been tremendously valuable for my business. But not because the podcasts themselves, the episodes themselves, generated enormous amounts of revenue. I wish. The real value came from everything the podcasts created. Clients finding me because they hear me on podcasts, students enrolled in my classes because they heard me explain legal concepts in a way that made sense, conference organizers inviting me to speak because they know my work, relationships formed, opportunities appearing, people who had never met me felt like they already knew me. The podcast wasn't the asset. It was the trust, the authority. The relationships are assets. The opportunities were assets. The podcast was simply the machine that allowed me to produce those things. And once you start looking at creator businesses through that lens, something interesting happens. You stop measuring success solely on the basis of downloads or views or subscribers or listens, and you start asking different questions. The questions are, am I building trust? Am I strengthening my brand? Am I creating intellectual property? Workflows, systems, processes, frameworks, those kinds of things. Am I building an audience and audience relationships? Am I creating assets that will still have value 5 years from now? Because that's how owners think. And that's where we need to talk about intellectual property. You see, most creators hear the phrase intellectual property and immediately think about copyright. And copyright is certainly part of the picture. That's what protects the individual episodes, the artwork, those kinds of things. The episodes are definitely intellectual property. Your videos are intellectual property. The written content you make, that's intellectual property. But there's so much more to it than that. Your show title might be intellectual property. It's a brand. And all your branding might be intellectual property. Probably is. The frameworks you develop, the methods that you teach, the systems that you've created, the resources and tools you build, all of these things can become valuable business assets. And in some cases, they're the assets that ultimately generate the greatest return. Think about how many creators eventually write books or launch courses or create memberships or offer consulting, licensing their content, developing products. The content creates the attention creates trust, and the trust creates opportunity. And opportunity is where enterprise value resides. That's the progression. The challenge is that many creators never even recognize what's happening. They're so busy creating next week's episode. Meanwhile, an entire collection of business assets is quietly growing in the background. And if they're smart, they'll figure out a way to turn it to account and exploit it. So think like an owner. This realization is really what changes everything, because once you understand what the real assets are, that's when you start making different decisions. You'll start protecting different things, investing in different things, and you'll start measuring success differently. For example, if audience trust is an asset, then protecting that trust becomes one of your most important jobs. Suddenly, not every sponsorship is a good sponsorship. Not every partnership is a good partnership. Not every opportunity is worth pursuing because it could undermine the trust. So you start evaluating opportunities based not only on the money they'll generate in the short term, but also on the effect they'll have on the assets you're building for tomorrow. Same thing is true for your intellectual property of other kinds. Lots of creators spend years building valuable content libraries without giving much thought to ownership. Who owns that content? Who owns the brand? What about the graphics, the website, the email list? Big value there. What about the social media accounts? Also big value there. Those questions don't seem so important when you're just trying to get your show off the ground or just showing up to try to be consistent about producing it every week. But they do become incredibly important once those assets really start building and accumulating value. Now, I've seen partnerships that fell apart because nobody clarified who owns things from the very beginning. I've seen creators lose control of brands that they spent years building, oftentimes just because of a casual mistake or having overlooked something. I've seen disputes over content libraries, audience lists, intellectual property that could have been avoided with just a little bit of planning. The assets were valuable, and that's why people fought over them. Content is what creators make. Assets are what they accumulate. And that's a very different way of looking at things. It's also the way buyers, investors, sophisticated business owners will tend to look at the world. They don't ask, how many episodes do you have? What they ask is, who owns this stuff, the intellectual property? How engaged is the audience? And sometimes it's not about the audience size as much as the depth of the connection to the audience. What systems are in place, they might ask, or what assets are transferable? These are business owner kinds of questions. And the sooner creators start asking them of themselves, the more intentional they can become about what they're building. Because whether you realize it or not, every episode is creating something. The question is whether you're building those assets on purpose or merely by accident. So if today's conversation has a single takeaway, it's this. The podcast isn't the asset. The podcast is the machine. The machine creates trust. The trust creates audience, and audience creates opportunity. And opportunity creates value. That's why your podcast might be much more valuable than you think, not because of the content itself, but because of everything that the content makes possible. Now, before we wrap up, I have a quick exercise I'd like you to do. Just sit down and make a list of the assets that your podcast or creator business has. Your content library, your brand, your audience, your email list, your website, your social channels, those relationships of yours. What relationships do you have? Your intellectual property, your reputation, your opportunities. And ask yourself another question. Which of these assets am I actively protecting? Because you can't protect assets until you've identified them. So this is a great first step. And once you recognize what you're actually building, well, then you can make smarter decisions about ownership and contracts and trademarks and copyrights, business structures, and all of the other pieces that help preserve and grow those assets over time. So if you need agreements and releases, contracts, and legal templates designed specifically for podcasters and creator businesses, I hope you'll head over to podcastlawforms.com, where you'll find lawyer-drafted resources that'll help you protect the business assets you are working so hard to build. Or reach out to me personally. You can find me on the web. I have a distinctive name, also an asset. And next time, we're going to tackle the question that naturally follows this. When does a podcast stop just being a hobby or a podcast and become a full-on business? That's next time on Legit Podcast Pro. And until then, I'm Gordon Firemark, and I'm inviting you to keep on creating, keep on building. And remember, the most valuable thing you're creating might not be the content at all. See you soon.